Take this opportunity to practice unblending so that when a part blends and takes over and begins influencing you under its agenda, you can be well practiced enough in the moment when that happens to be able to unblend from the part by compassionately approaching it to see what's up with it. Self-energy access. This is a scale to measure and then measure again and then measure again as you're doing unblending or as you're being taken over by a part, the impact it's having on you. Now, I'm not saying that what I got here is a perfect representation of your system, not at all. It's just a guide. You may find words here that are familiar to you because the goal of the IFS model is to give you more self-energy access. That's the goods. That's the stuff where your parts are loving life. They're suffering when we're at a 1. In fact, here's what suffering looks like at a 1 for some of us. It might look slightly different for you. Your thoughts are critical, panicked, and overwhelmed. Your emotions, despairing, insecure, and frustrated. Your body, somatic, constricted, tense, and drained. Your energies fragmented and blocked. Your state of being is reactive, guarded, and disconnected. So that's a pretty good description for when you're just shut off from self-energy, isn't it? Maybe you'd add your own words. I hope you would. If you've moved up to 2, it still looks like suffering, but maybe not quite as bad. If you have even some access to self-energy, things begin to move a little bit. Your thoughts now, rather than being critical, panicked, and overwhelmed, are more like unsure, questioning, cautious. Emotions, nervous, tentative, and restless, but not despair anymore. Somatic, slightly uneasy and jittery, not so drained or tense. Energy, intermittent, cautious and flow. At least it's starting to break up and move. And state of being, uncertain and wavering, rather than reactive, guarded, and disconnected. And then 3 seems like a pretty big leap, because once we really start getting self-energy to flow in, it begins to create its own momentum. And very quickly, we shift so that when we have sufficient access to self-energy, our thoughts now are more insightful, accepting, and optimistic. Emotions, more trusting, steady, and encouraged. Somatic, in our body, we feel more comfortable and relaxed. Energetically, our energy, our life force is more even and accessible. And then our state of being is more grounded and adaptable. And if we're really cooking, then we got ample amounts of access to self-energy. Thoughts are intuitive, appreciative, generous. Emotions are loving, confident, and harmonious. Our body feels calm, vibrant, and rejuvenated. Energy is flowing smoothly in abundance. And our state of being is engaged, integrated, and content. And then if we're at a 5 and we're having one of those outlier peak experiences, peak access to self-energy might look like spacious, deeply wise, and profoundly quiet thoughts. Blissful, unconditional, loving, radiant joy emotions. Expansive, buoyant, profoundly still body experience. Infinite and seamlessly connected energy. And a transcendent, fully present, and effortlessly authentic state of being. So that's just a way to think about self-energy. Let's kind of do a little bit of a review of what we already know, but maybe don't consciously think about in terms of IFS and parts. So we know some things. We know that our parts do what makes sense for them to do. It's like the Byron Katie thing, where anytime I argue with reality, I suffer. We can turn that statement around. If I'm suffering, it's because I am arguing with reality, right? Now, let's take a statement that would come from IFS, maybe similar to what Byron Katie would say. Anytime our parts are influencing us, it's because something is happening for them that makes perfectly good sense to them. They're doing what they do because it makes sense to them. So if my parts are doing something, it's because it somehow makes sense. What if I made my objective to find out and understand why it makes sense? How about if I can get aligned with them and understand and get attuned with my parts so that I get why they're doing what they're doing? So that if I were in their position, I would do it too. That's, I believe, the way to think about unblending. If we can approach unblending with our parts from that perspective, then our parts are going to be far more open, forthcoming with information, sharing with us, because they know that that's why we're there, as opposed to we're showing up to unblend so that we can change them. We're showing up to unblend because they're a problem. Parts are not going to be open and forthcoming with information if they are perceived as a problem. I think most of us can remember being kids and being perceived as problems. We didn't feel safe. We certainly weren't going to give the person that was annoyed with us more information. We want to comply. Our parts are exactly the same way. We take on a critical parent role with our parts. They're not going to let us understand. There's no way. They're too scared. So that makes, I think, that's the case I want to make for why a compassionate intervention to a blending makes more sense than pausing and trying to get your parts to step back and stop doing what they're doing, which I did for the first few years I knew about IFS. Is I thought that unblending meant noticing my parts were influencing me and then getting them to stop. In other words, I gave the control panel over to my best manager. Manager, I'm tired of these parts. Would you get them corralled and get them managed and get them controlled for me? Because I'm just sick of this. Of course, that's another part. And now what I'm seeing and realizing is that really true leadership, self-leadership, means helping our parts to unblend by joining them and becoming attuned to them so that we can actually offer them anything that we have of resource that they might be able to use. If we just ask parts to step back because they're inconvenient right now, then we're basically what we're doing is we're planting a landmine to step on later. And so what we're talking about today is the practical application of this unblending or compassionate intervention for just your everyday life, for you. If we want to rush through this by getting parts to step back, check with your system, and you'll find out your system says, no, it's not okay to do. Every single one of us deserves to be respected. We need it. Every one of us need to do this with permission. Parts do exactly what they do because it makes sense for them to do it. For example, we have a very heroic part that, whether it was willingly exiled or not, and probably not, its fate has been to be isolated from the rest of the system as much as possible and to heroically hold the energy and memory and belief of the traumatic event, of the event that was too great to be digested in the moment and had to be held and fractured off from the rest of the system. It heroically has been doing that. And now, when we finally get to it, when our protectors finally say, yeah, please, would you please help with this pesky little exile part? It's not little, for one thing. It's mammoth. An exile is, I mean, there's no way to really quantify it, but if we're talking about little or big, it's got to be huge to be able to contain and hold all of this energy of the pain, of the dysfunctional, unworkable belief, of overwhelming experience that was too much for us to experience. And now as adults, we can handle it. As adults, for the most part, if we have done enough healing, we do have now the capacity to handle it. And so it's time to bring some relief to that exile so it no longer has to carry all that energy and all that experience and all that memory and all that pain, and to be integrated back into the system. That's going to be a process. That's going to take some time. We need to give it the attention that it deserves. All right, let's put this to work. Let's actually use what we've talked about now to see if we can practice compassionate intervention. So I'm going to ask you to think of a time, try to make it as recent as possible, and try to make it as specific as possible. In other words, not generalities. Oh, my life's hard right now. That isn't going to work. Something happened at 9:22 a.m. on Tuesday, And when it happened, this is how I was impacted by it. So just think of that experience, take 2 minutes and describe the experience and everything that you can remember that you experienced that indicates that your parts took over. You probably noticed as you described everything as you did in that circumstance where parts took over, that you were influenced in several ways. Those influences are all trailheads. They can all serve as trailheads to explore, but we can only explore one part at a time. So focusing in on each of those trailheads, which are represented by the way parts influenced you when they took over, what's the one influence that you want to explore? Take just a moment until you're clear on what's the one influence that you'd like to explore today to unblend from. What would help you the most if you could unblend from a particular influence in that circumstance that you experienced? So the part that brought that influence that you want to explore, that's going to be your target part. And now you've recalled this experience. You've described some of the ways that you were influenced. So how was I influenced? What was my thinking? What was going on emotionally? What was happening somatically? What was happening with my energy? Did I have impulses? How did I react under the influence of this part? Now we want to narrow the focus down a little bit more. Of everything that you described about your thoughts, your emotions, your body experiences and sensations, your energy, your impulses, and your behavior, if you could really understand the part that's bringing that influence, which of those influences would you like to focus on? If you had all day to do this, you could spend time with each one of them, but we're going to just spend time with one. As you remembered all this, I suspect that you've begun to blend back in again with this part, whether you wanted to or not. Considering the actual experience and let that represent 100% of what you experienced, because that's what it was. You had 100% of that experience in the experience. Now you're remembering it. What percentage of the experience are you having now? It's not actually happening, but you're remembering it. Your parts are getting activated again. And now the important question about that is, do you have enough space around it to still be with it rather than to be in it? I'm going to ask you to go back to the situation, remember where your self energy was in the moment that this thing happened, that when your parts took over. So taking a look at this scale, what number would you give yourself? And it could be, 1.275. It could be 3.25, something like that. Just whatever number seems to be most appropriate for you. When you were in the experience, does it feel to you like you have enough access to, and maybe spaciousness or room around the memory where you can be with it rather than be in it? Do you feel like you have enough room inside to be with the memory of what happened so that you can be with it rather than be in it? So you've detailed out thoughts, emotions, somatic energy, impulses, and behavior. And you've chosen one of those influences. Now we want to get curious about it. So you want to ask all your parts now, all your other parts. Just check in with your system. Can your other parts be with you while you learn more about the part that brought this influence? Or do they have too much concern? So that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have concerns, worries, or judgments. They probably do. But apparently, they're not so great that they can't join you with some curiosity and be open minded and maybe even move to open wonder with you to see if we can learn something about the part that brought that influence. Like, what happened? What happened with this part? Don't we want to know? And apparently, your parts want to know. Right. So now shifting toward the part, we're going to refer to it as your target part, the part that you're focusing on, the part that brought that influence. And we're going to begin to ask it some questions. The first question is it okay for us to ask you some questions? Is it okay for me to ask you some questions? Notice how that part reacts to that. We want to practice it now after the fact. You're going to practice this unblending, this compassionate intervention enough after life gives you some examples that you can work with so that the next time life gives you an example to work with, you can actually try it in real time. So now what we want to do, we've gone through the whole process where we're actually in connection with the part that brought the influence. And we're asking it, is it okay if we get to know you and understand you better? Can we ask you some questions? The answer is yes. So the question now is just wide open. Okay, what do you want me to understand? So I'm going to go 2 minutes on the clock, ask that question and see what happens. What target part do you want me to understand? Now notice you have a little bit more information there. Maybe you already knew this, maybe you didn't. If you already knew it, then at the very least, this is a validation of what you thought you knew about this part. But if it's new information, that may actually spark some new curiosity for you. Oh, I didn't know that. So, given that information, now what do you want to know? So, check in with yourself. Check in with whatever parts are at the control panel of this exploration for you right now. What do they want to know next? And then ask that question. You've asked your target part, the part that brought the influence that you're exploring now. You've asked it, is it okay for us to know you? Yes. Or to ask some questions? Sure. We got a yes. What do you want us to know? The part revealed something to you. You either knew that already and feel validated by the answer, or it's new information. Either way, you may have a new spark of curiosity now, just based on either being validated or getting new information. From that place of curiosity, what do you want to know? And the way I restated it was, imagine that there's a control panel in your mind that parts station themselves at to have influence over the way that you think and see. So we assume all parts are welcome. There are no bad parts, and every part's doing what it's doing because it's trying to help and because it makes sense for it to do what it does. All of that just as groundwork for basic 101 IFS. If we don't know that, then IFS isn't going to work. If we don't know that there are no bad parts, if we don't welcome all parts, and if we forget or don't know that every part is doing everything that they're doing because it makes perfectly good sense to them to do, and nothing else makes more sense to them than that, then we really can't learn much about our parts because they will be too guarded. They won't feel safe enough to reveal themselves to us. So when a part comes in and says, hey, that's not helpful, that part's trying to help. And it has an impact on the part that was the other part that was trying to help. It feels criticized. So now the neutral observation of this is, I see this part was trying to help, and it actually wasn't helpful. I need to get in relationship with this part that was trying to be helpful and wasn't, so that I can understand what it was trying to accomplish, build enough trust with this part that it allows me to offer something that might be helpful. We have asked a couple of questions from the target part. What do you want us to know? What do you want us to understand? And the next question came from, hopefully, some curiosity that got inspired from either being validated or from learning something new that you didn't know before. So, we could go into just the template questions. Those are nice to be able to know that they're there. We can go to, what do you do for me? How do you do it? What are you afraid will happen if you don't do it? Those are all great questions. But for this unblending, we're not doing a full bore exploration. Our entire objective is to get our self energy back up to a point where we can now provide self leadership. So, where are you now? I would continue to check in, and let's do it now. With every single question you ask, notice what happens with your self energy. Now, if your number increased a little bit, great. Your self energy is increasing. You have a greater capacity to provide self leadership. In other words, your parts are starting to feel safer. starting to trust you a little bit. If that number stayed the same, there's still that higher level of concern by one or more parts. So you might need to check in and notice. Let's check the scale one more time. Remember, this self-energy scale is to measure how much access you have to self-energy. You're not generating more self-energy. The self-energy is there like the sun behind the clouds. Doing an unblending begins to part the clouds a little bit, and you begin to get a little bit of warmth from the sun. If it serves you, use this tool or just notice in another way. Do you have more access to self-energy right now than you had before you started this process?